Welcome back to Dungeon Brew and our settlement series. Today we're going to be talking about villages. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Here at Dungeon Brew, we are about to release our first large crowdfunding project on BackerKit. It is Thagum. It is a new campaign setting manual that gives you a grim, dark steampunk world. Over 200 plus pages. That's going to have new subclasses, new lineages, new weapons, gritty firearm mechanics, new feats, new monsters, city guides, and so much more. We are launching on September 9th, and we are looking for you just to go and follow the page right now and be ready for that launch. So follow the link, go check it out, and then come back to the video.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Dungeon Brew. Today we're going to be talking about villages in our settlement series. We've already talked about roadhouses and hamlets, and we still have to talk about cities and metropolises. So we're about halfway through this process of getting through the various types of settlements. Before we get into the very specifics of what a village might look like, Josh, will you kind of give us an idea of how this differs from a hamlet?
Yeah, absolutely. A village, I like to say, is where the wilderness ends and civilization begins, though that may be true for a hamlet as well. But it differs in the way that you typically have about 1,000 or fewer individuals that are living within a village. It's got multiple structures, dozens of structures that are set up across a landscape. And as it grows, you see them developing additional trade routes or mercantile trade groups there. Usually you have about two, usually not more than two, but you may have several different industries that are built around those particular things. You might have two different mining industries or two different lumber industries, or you might have a mining and a lumber and another one that exists there as well. But you see them essentially growing in terms of the amenities that are available to individuals that are passing through.
Right, and in terms of like the size of it, we're kind of getting into this place where we end up in a scale, like the sliding scale of where does this exactly fit. So you mentioned less than 1,000 individuals, but when you're approaching that 1,000 point, you're getting into a very large village, maybe into a town. So we kind of put that cutoff in there to give some idea of where it fits. But technically, a village could also be 150, which is only slightly larger than a hamlet. So try to think about this in terms of, is this a small village where it's like there is still only one industry, or is this a large village where you have multiple industries that are in competition with one another, or is it somewhere in the middle? We're going to give a bunch of options and a variety of different things that can be included in a village. You just have to decide how large or how impactful various aspects of this are going to be when you come to constructing your settlement.
And I'll be honest, when I'm building a village, I may not get into the nitty gritty like I would with hamlets or with even the roadhouses that we talked about before.
Right.
I get a clear idea of what some of those organizations are or those amenities are. I'll build some key NPCs in particular areas like religion and government, that are running any of these industrial areas. But I am not really outlining the entire village, especially if it's a large one. If it's a small one, I might have an idea of where some of the houses and structures are, but I got a lot of empty, just boxes on the map that I'm utilizing, and the primary places are what I'm focusing on to build out from.
Right. Generally speaking, a good way, especially as you get into larger locations, is to not try and build out every single structure. Like you said, you build out the key ones. You go, these are the taverns. I know my PCs are going to want to try and hit up taverns. This is the luxury trade goods store because they would actually have a magic item. I bet they'll check that out. Here are the religious sites. Here are, those major things. These are the major industries because I know there's going to be this quest that has to do with these two, mining barons who are going to war with one another. This is where the actual Thieves Guild is located. And then from there, what you do is you create a short list of residences or people. And if your PCs randomly decide that they're going to break into a house to see what's in there, you just consult your short list of these are different various houses. And if you run through that entire list, then you'll have to make another list. But generally speaking, you don't need to have every single thing built into the entire city, because it's a lot of extra effort on your part that probably is going to have very little payoff in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really, we talked about story. We don't really need to get into a lot with story and theme when we're talking about this. You can check out our earlier videos to get some idea about what we said about keeping it in line with like your campaign and your quest and what you're doing. But you don't want to go too far off into the weeds, like you're saying, and building this particular thing. You just want to make sure that it is kind of going in tune with the adventure that you're setting up for your players.
Right. And something that we didn't really talk a whole lot about in some of our previous videos was the variety of cultures or races or whatever that you might see in smaller ones, smaller hamlets and roadhouses. Generally speaking, you're probably going to have one type. You know, it's like this is an orc village, or this is an orc hamlet, or this is a human hamlet, or this is a halfling one. When you get into a village, you start to see some diversity probably in the population, more growth in terms of you're mixing different types of people, different cultures. It's a gathering place because there's trade to be found. There's wealth to be found in a village. People are going there in order to establish livelihoods. They're going there because they have a craft that they're trying to sell. So you can get a little bit more creative in that regard. I would still have a basal population of some kind, so you would still have a halfling or a human or whatever population, but you would probably see anywhere between 5 and 20% of other types of races or populations being part of that as well.
Mm-hmm. So I just throwing questions at you here, John. When you're looking at building a village, what are some of the options that you look for in terms of business structures or mercantile places that you put into them? We kind of hit some highlights here in making sure that you have an industry like mining or lumber, possibly even some sort of husbandry type of industry.
Right.
But what are other options that they may consider that aren't maybe seen as often in villages?
So something that you can get into more creative types of mining. So it doesn't necessarily have to just be like a copper mine or an iron mine or a stone quarry. You might get into like marble quarries where they actually have something that's valuable. You might see a silver mine or something like that. And it may not be a big mine. It may be smaller because it is just a village. And generally speaking, anywhere that there's wealth, like I said, there's going to be more people. So you probably aren't going to have a silver mine and then a population of 150 people. It's probably going to be on that larger end, and it's probably a growing village that will soon be a town of some kind. So in regard to that, I think that you can get a little bit more creative with mining. When it comes to agriculture, your agriculture is probably still going to be on the outskirts of the village and possibly in surrounding hamlets. So when you have a village, it requires a lot of food, and it requires a lot of land in order to do that. So you would have small outlying hamlets that produce food, and the food comes into the village, and the village then consumes that because they have to rely on outlying structures or outlying agriculture in order to provide that. Fishing development might be seen as an increase in this type of location if it's coastal or if it's on a river. And then you start getting into things like actual mercantile, which I think is something that you mentioned in your question. You get into refined craftsmen, right? So generally speaking, the roadhouses, we talked about this, and in the hamlets, it's the same way. You might have a blacksmith. You're probably only going to have one, and they're probably not going to be particularly great. Most of what they do is probably specific to the industry that they're responsible for. So the blacksmith in the hamlet that does trees, that does lumber, is going to be very good at creating saws, but probably not very good at creating a sword or a shield or armor or anything else, because all they do is make saws all day. Sawzall. And if you're talking about a village, you start getting into refined craftsmanship. So you might have a jeweler, you might have a silversmith, you might have somebody who specializes in creating armor or weapons, particularly if there's a military outpost there. So you can get creative in those regards as well, so that there are refined or specific types of craftsmanship in this type of location.
And that's almost exactly what I was aiming at, is that you have to make sure that the shops that are available within your village are in relation to whatever the industry is within that area. If you have individuals that are going out and if you have a lot of husbandry taking place, so a lot of farms that are out there around the outskirts where they're raising cattle and pigs and sheep, maybe you have a tanner, maybe you have a butcher. You may not have a miner or a goldsmith or someone who's crafting these things if there's no mining industry in the area. You may not have a jeweler if they don't have access to those things. If there's a fishing trade that's taking place, then you're going to have shops that are built around that specifically, that are focused on, bait and tackle and creating ropes and building ships and all these other things. And the other piece that comes into this that you have to be considerate of is what the government looks like within this setting based on those types of industries that you have built. They may be highly focused on the red tape and the licensure and the things that you have to dive through in order to have certain regulations set up in that area too, which is not something that we always consider as GMs.
Right, and that's an interesting thing, is to look at the government as a growth of the industry that is located there. So you can have, we've talked about things like gerontocracies; those make sense in things like hamlets. It's less likely to see that in a village because, again, where wealth occurs, there's going to be more people, but there's also people who are going to be interested in obtaining power. So you're no longer probably going to have a knight overseeing a village. You're going to have the next rank up, whether that's an earl or a count or even just a mayor who answers to somebody who is higher up in that pecking order. But you might also have things where there are people who are seizing power or taking control of it. In terms of military, the military might be in control of it because they want to seize the wealth and the authority and other things in order to promote their bottom line. You can have religious type governments, fanatical governments that are interested in obtaining, again, that wealth and that power in order to see their direction moving forward, which is a very Italian, I want to say, like medieval Italian type thing, where you have a bunch of city-states and whoever happened to be in control of that city-state manage the wealth and the power, and then you have the Pope, obviously, who would try and corral all of those, but they answered ultimately to him, even though they were in control of their own city-state.
Yeah, and I think that religious piece is important to think about, and I don't want to dive into it too deeply, but just knowing that religion or some sort of cultural understanding is going to around that belief system is going to exist within a village. You may have a split of people believing one thing and another group believing another, but for the most part in villages, you sometimes have this collaborative belief that exists throughout the citizens, maybe towards a particular god or a pantheon of gods. You may have a parish that exists within here or a couple of small churches that exist, depending on how big your village is. You're probably not going to have something as big as a cathedral. Right. We built this village around the cathedral.
Yeah.
But there are going to be maybe a temple that's located outside of the village, or a shrine, or again, that parish that's part of a larger church in the region.
And the other thing is that, and I kind of mentioned this, but I do want to focus on this just a little bit, is that what is valued in the village should probably inform the way that it is governed and what people respect. So if you have something like religion being the focus, a theocracy makes sense in this type of situation. The theocratic elements of the government may still answer to a different power, but that might be what rules it. You could also have something like a plutocracy. If you've got the merchants, there's a merchant council who is in control of the village, and they're the ones who determine what's right and what's wrong and what's done. Then, but they still may answer to a higher up. And we've talked about things like patriarchies and matriarchies. You can also have something just as simple as like an aristocracy that exists in the village where the nobility in some way is in control. But consider what is important to the village, and that maybe determines who is actually in control of what is going on a day-to-day basis.
And I will say there will, again, be some divides in there. I mean, you may have those that are more conservative and those that are more liberal, etc. But one of the things that you're speaking about that I think is probably true to me when I think of the roadhouses, the hamlets, and villages, is they all serve as an echo chamber. So right. The beliefs and the culture and the ideas that are paramount within that region are just very much held. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, they reinforce themselves.
They do. They very much do. And my thing that I love about this, particularly in the eyes of entertainment that you have existing within that village, that entertainment is probably also going to centralize around these themes. When I think of a hamlet or I think of a roadhouse, the entertainment there is usually common stories, common myths, common lore that you may hear that's been shared across the world and known for thousands of years.
Right.
When I think of the entertainment that you're going to find within a village that is centralized around these themes, I'm thinking of things like Chaucer or Shakespeare, where they're poking fun or bringing attention, bringing the microscope down onto things within that system that may not be working right or is working really well. They're poking at the parish leader. They're poking at the fishing industry. They're telling stories around the history and the upbringing of that village and bringing that to the attention. Almost like they're testing the waters to see what they can get away with.
Yeah, and I think that that's an interesting thing to focus in on. Also keep in mind that it is a village, so it's probably not that good still. You might have that opportunity where it's like, again, there's somebody who's good, but most of the time, if somebody is really good, they're going to be in the cities. You know, they're not going to be in this village, because a village is still a village. A lot of the things that we're talking about here are, they're going to be a part of this village, but they're not going to be fully fleshed out, right? It's not the same as a city that has the opportunity to pull from a larger pool of people who are better at what they do. Oftentimes in something like a village, you have a council of merchants, but all of the merchants are a part of it, and you probably only have one or two that have any actual money, and most of them don't have much at all, and they're part of the council, and they're kind of there, but they don't understand what's going on, or they don't think I was going to say, where they don't think it's worth their time, and they, just the one or two merchants rule everything anyway because nobody else cares.
I was going to say, or they were born into their wealth and they don't actually know how to accrue it or develop it. And so I almost think of like the people that you have in the village, as apart from the city and the metropolises, are like your C&D actors. They have a skill, but it's not as refined. They don't have the same training and the same pressures that really help them become great at what they do. They're just mediocre and they're able to get by.
You really think of it as a big fish in a small pond type situation. Yeah. Like they are in control. Whoever is in control is in control. They're probably not very adept at whatever it is that they do. And this is going to be generally true of most of the people who are in this type of locale. And in lesser locales, and even when we get into towns, it's not really until you start getting into cities that you see people who are good at that have a craft and are exceptional at their craft. Most of the time, you're going to have somebody who is decent at their craft. You bring them this sword in order for them to fix it. They might be able to fix an actual sword. You bring them a magic sword, they have no idea how to approach this. And if you let them try and tackle it, they'll probably ruin it.
So I'm thinking of other things in the village that we haven't discussed that we have shared in other videos. The first thing that comes to mind that we probably haven't covered fully is military. For me personally, when I think of villages, and you might be able to add quite a bit to this, but I think of town guard. You might have a sheriff or something equal to that. Right. A couple of volunteer policemen that join him from time to time to investigate things or see things. But if there is any type of military, it's rather small and centralized, or it's being overseen by a larger region, a larger city where they have people that are stationed there to garrison or something.
Right, and this really kind of depends on the development that you want to see in this type of location. So you might have something where you have the traditional fantasy-esque, town guard. If you're aiming for like a more realistic type approach, you probably don't have much standing military to begin with. There is probably a strict moral or religious type influence that keeps people in line. And when there's actual issues that occur, those get brought before whoever happens to be in charge. And that can be anywhere along the spectrum of, do you have a magistrate? Do you have a town elder? Do you have the council of merchants? Who is responsible for handling disputes? This is part of the reason why villages make good locations for things like a thieves guild, because there's nobody to actually hunt them down. They probably don't have a town guard, or if they do, like you said, they're probably volunteers, or they're not very good at what they do. They're aware that people are getting robbed, but they don't have the deductive reasoning to go Sherlock Holmes through people's homes and figure out who actually stole anything.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great place to look at different areas of corruption in these small areas where there's not going to be any type of oversight. Maybe there are licensures that need to be done and a centralized government that's there, but nobody necessarily enforce those laws. So you may have underground slave trades that are taking place, or children that are being taken, or charlatans that are stealing coin from passerbys that are coming through, and people that are just, they may know about it, but they can't prove it.
Yeah, and it's kind of similar to the Hamlet where we talked about, it's like that's that one family that you know is shady and you know that they're going around stealing chickens and stealing eggs, but you can't really prove it, so they continue to exist. In the village, that's scaled up. Now you have an organization, potentially, of people who are doing this type of work. You know that there are people in the village. You might even know that, this one guy, he's real shady. I'm pretty sure that he is always stealing stuff. And most people could point him out, but nobody can prove it. And so the magistrate can't hold him liable, because anytime that guy gets brought before him, there's no proof and nobody can decide what exactly is going on with him.
Or if they can prove it, they don't have the manpower to stop it.
Right.
They can't overthrow it. And sometimes this is a lead into quests that happen in these areas where the Black Hand, or whatever, or the whoever it is doing something and controlling all the trade and the things within that region, but the magistrate isn't strong enough to stop them because they don't have the manpower.
Or the magistrate himself is corrupt.
Yeah.
So, but you can get creative with this. Keep in mind the limitations of what people are willing to address. So, in something like a plutocracy where wealth is in control, they might actually fund a private town guard in order to try and stop this type of thing, because money is important and it's worth spending the money to stop thieves from taking what's yours. If you're talking about something like a theocracy, they may not have the money to do so because it's a strict moral compass that rules this. They're not interested in money. They don't have the funds. And so they only have volunteers. And so then you're limited by, are the volunteers competent enough to do this? Really, like I said, you can get creative, and there's a long laundry list of various options that you can get into for how do you want to handle the rule of law in this type of location, and what are the consequences for that. Oftentimes, consequences for breaking the law, I think, in this type of location are probably going to be physical punishment that will put people back out on the street because it's expensive to actually hold people in a prison. Imprisoning people is not something that you see a whole lot in older societies, pre-medieval or medieval. It's more likely that people are either killed, they are fined, or they are physically punished. And those are really where people land. Imprisoning someone is not something that occurs very often because, like I said, it costs money to do that, and it's not worth the money to do it.
Yeah, got to raise taxes on all the people. In any case, I think the advice that I talked about in the Hamlet holds true here as well, is that if you are building a village and you're bringing your players into it, one of the things that oftentimes happens is that players get stuck in that village and they just continue going off into different tangents and get stuck in that village and don't get to explore the world at a larger capacity. A lot of initial adventures that I know that you and I ran when we were younger always started in a village, and it was usually a one-off. Something that you just kind of went in and you solved the problem and that was the game, and then you went on your merry way. But if you're using this in a greater campaign, make sure that you're linking the happenings within that village to something that's occurring beyond the scope of what they're seeing on those streets, so the players are encouraged to go and explore the rest of the world, and they don't spend 8 levels just traveling around doing things in this one location. Unless that's what your game is. If that's what your game is, that's great.
Yeah. And keep in mind that the size and the development of something like a village needs to make sense within the larger context of the world and the society that you're building. Something I mentioned earlier was that, hamlets would be feeding the village type of a thing. But if you have a mining community and nothing is done but mining, and they're mining stone, or it's a lumber community and all they're doing is wood, there's probably not a whole lot of food around, so the population should be limited by the access to food. Or in the case where it's like maybe they do have a very robust mining population but they're mining silver, so they have money. They're able to cart in food and they get the food in there, but it's like it's costing them money to do this. And what are the repercussions of that if suddenly there is, no food to be bought? How does the village cope with this type of situation? But this is something that gets really important as we get into larger cities, towns, cities, and metropolises, is that there is a limitation to the size of these, particularly in medieval times, for how big they can get based off of the food that they can accrue and then feed the population that lives there.
Yeah. Great advice, John. Anything else that you want to share about villages before we call it quits and talk to them next week?
I don't think so. That will be it for villages.
All right. Well, you guys hit the like button and subscribe, and we will see you all next time.
Dungeon